Hello everyone, welcome to week 6 of our course. We're going to focus on federal health reform. We're going to spend most of our time talking about the Supreme Court case. First of all, thanks for being patient. There's a lot going on. I explained in the emails to you what was happening this week. The main issue recently was my wife giving birth last night, and I didn't get to sleep till around 4 a.m. Because of all the stuff that was going on. But we have a healthy baby, and that's a great thing, and so I'm happy for that. All right, overview. So we're going to talk about the topic this week and focus on the Supreme Court case. I think it makes no sense to ignore the case. It wasn't part of our original reading because we weren't quite sure when the decision would come out. But now that it's out, we should really spend our time on that for the class. So this week, I asked you to take a look at some readings on the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. And I think these are readings that give you a good sense of what's going on in the act, and you can easily walk through and see what's happened to date, what was meant to happen immediately after the passing of the bill, and so on. You can get a sense of the history of the bill, and the Kaiser timeline that you've been provided will show you what's coming and what we've already done, and you'll see basically what we can check off our list in terms of our achievements with this Affordable Care Act. So a few highlights of success, which you can see in your reading, are that now we have no more denials of children with pre-existing conditions. Unfortunately, a caveat of this is that some insurers have decided to not offer child or individual insurance policies to children. So instead of paying for the kids with pre-existing conditions, some insurers have just kind of gotten out of this business, and that's unfortunate, but it doesn't work for their business model. So and that's just bound to happen. That's one of those unintended consequences that you have to think about when you're constructing new laws. Now we have people 26 and under are able to stay on their parents' insurance. That's good for them. It may not be so great for parents who thought they were able to or thought they were going to be able to take these individuals off their insurance by 22 because they were graduating from college and hopefully able to fend for themselves out in the world. But this does help some kids who are in grad school, for example. So that's really that's a population that classically has been more uninsured simply because they're young and they think they're immortal, and so they don't get insurance. But when they have an accident and end up in the hospital, the lack of insurance just causes huge problems. So we really need that group to be insured, and that group also helps really carry the weight for other people who have more severe illnesses and who are older, because this group, since they're primarily healthy, they're basically just pushing money into the pool for insurance companies that they can then use to help other people. So, keeping those individuals insured up to 26 is very beneficial, and we've seen a drop in the number of uninsured in that age group. The Affordable Care Act has also provided a rebate to seniors to cover a gap in their prescription drug coverage. So these are seniors who are on Medicare and they have prescription drug coverage from something called Part D of Medicare. But the coverage actually went up to a certain point, then it stopped, and then after they paid $1,000 more on their own, the coverage would start again, essentially. So there was a gap in their coverage. And the Affordable Care Act gets rid of that gap by providing them with some rebates, and then moving forward, just providing them with coverage all the way through to a certain limit, of course. There are also no more rescissions by insurance companies. And although we make these statements about what the laws do, the laws are only as good as enforcement. So I'm sure there are insurers still out there who are taking people off of their insurance because the person has become too costly, even though it's illegal. So these laws have to be enforced, and I'm sure you'll hear lots of stories about things that are still going wrong in the system because the laws just aren't being enforced well. So the next stage of any law this big is to enforce it well. All right, now let's focus on the Supreme Court decision. So the Supreme Court essentially decided that the lawsuit was not barred by the Anti-Injunction Act, and that the Affordable Care Act individual mandate is upheld on the basis of it being a tax, and we'll talk more about that, and that the Medicaid expansion that the federal government planned was actually forced the states to change too much, and so that now the federal government cannot require the federal government cannot remove funding from Medicaid programs in order to persuade the states to engage in Medicaid expansion. And I'll talk about that some more here. All right, first let's talk about the Anti-Injunction Act. This is something you don't hear much about it in the news. It's fairly complex. It's a bit esoteric. It's a really old law. But essentially this law states that if you tax someone, so if the federal government taxes someone, the person cannot bring a lawsuit indicating that that tax is unconstitutional until they've actually paid the tax. And then they bring a lawsuit to get a refund for what they've paid. Now that may seem a bit strange to you, but the idea is that Congress has lots of taxes, and they have pretty broad taxing power to bring in the money and revenue for the federal government, and of course just don't want to get tied up into all these various taxes until they've really actually been enforced and worked themselves out. And because people would bring in all kinds of cases if they were just thinking that they needed to file a lawsuit just because they were being taxed for whatever reason. So the idea is just really, this is really focused on judicial administration or the efficiency of our court system. We don't want the court system clogged up with a lot of this stuff. So this is one way to go about doing that. Well, the Supreme Court indicated that the individual mandate requirement, which has a penalty attached to it if you don't actually get health insurance, is not taxed for the purposes of this particular act. So throughout the Affordable Care Act, if you read it, and it's obviously a very long, slightly boring read, but if you read it, or if you at least look in the sections that focus on the minimum essential coverage requirement, and that's what we know commonly as the individual mandate, but it's actually not called the individual mandate in the law, so it's called the minimum essential coverage requirement. So if you're looking for it in the law, that's what you're going to find. The law, that aspect of the law just talks about a penalty. It doesn't talk about a tax at all, but later on it indicates that the IRS will enforce this penalty, so it looks something like a tax later. But the Supreme Court says, well, for the purpose of the Anti-Injunction Act, this is not a tax, this is just a penalty, and so therefore this act does not bar the individual mandate case. So the case can be brought forward, and so they looked at the issues of the case. All right. So for the minimum essential coverage requirement, or the individual mandate, sorry, I forgot a quote there. The Supreme Court decided that it is not allowed based on the Commerce Clause. So the Commerce Clause essentially states that the federal government can regulate commerce between states. If commerce is just within one state, the federal government doesn't touch that. But if that commerce somehow impacts other states around, either nearby or far away, it doesn't really matter. If it impacts other states in some way, then that's a federal issue, right? Because the federal government is concerned about all of the states, not just one state. So the government was arguing that because health insurance is used in various states, you can take your health insurance and use it wherever you go. Essentially, interstate commerce was taking place. Well, the Supreme Court, I think, recognized that yes, that's commerce, but they indicated that you cannot force someone to buy a private service in order to regulate interstate commerce. So the Supreme Court thinks that people who don't have health insurance are currently not engaged in commerce. And so as a result, if we force them to buy health insurance, we're pushing them to become involved in commerce. And so you can't regulate non-activity. So if people are not actually currently involved in some commerce, you can't force them to get involved and then say, well, now you actually have to buy certain things because you're involved. That's a bit strange, right? So that's the Supreme Court's perception of what's going on with people who are uninsured. The government's argument is actually that people who are uninsured cost money. they're actually doing something. So if you're uninsured and you get into an accident, then you're going to come to the hospital, right? And somebody's going to have to pay for it. So you're involved in commerce, the commerce of healthcare and health insurance, whether you like it or not. Even though you're not insured. And so the Supreme Court uh, does not agree with that argument. They think you're actually not engaged in any commerce, and so they stated that this is not allowed based on the Commerce Clause. So the Supreme Court did state that this individual mandate is allowed based on Congress's taxing power, which is fairly broad. And when they looked at whether the penalty for the individual mandate is actually a tax, they use a functional approach. So even though the law itself does not state that this is a tax, it actually calls the penalty, it labels it a penalty throughout the law. The Supreme Court states that functionally this is a tax, and here's why. Um, it functions like a tax because if you if you don't purchase insurance, then you're punished by the IRS, right? So it's not as though law enforcement is making you pay this penalty or some other body is making you pay it. It's the IRS. It's the agency that we depend on to gather tax money, right? That agency is actually out there gathering the money from you. Um, there are no other legal consequences beyond paying the penalty. So all you have to do is either pay this tax or get insurance. If you don't pay the tax, well, there's no other repercussions. You don't end up, there are no criminal penalties, of course. There's no lien would be put on your house or no other problems would arise. Essentially, you just have to pay the tax and you're charged the tax. Now, how this will be administered is a big question. We'll see moving forward. But the Supreme Court just says, look, this is essentially only a tax. It's really meant to gather money from these people who are uninsured because they're placing some burden on society, and they can either decide to get insurance or they can pay this tax. And so on that basis, the individual mandate can move forward. Now the pros for Democrats is that because the individual mandate is passed, Democrats can say, well, look, Supreme Court supported the Affordable Care Act, this monumental effort that we've engaged in to improve the healthcare system. And so it looks as though the Supreme Court is on their side when it's not really quite that. It's not, the support is not really quite that strong. And in fact, the basis that Democrats really wanted the Supreme Court to use to support the individual mandate was actually struck down by the court. So the Commerce Clause, they actually did not agree with Democrats on that. But that's how it might be spun by Democrats. On the other side, Republicans might say, well, this essentially didn't meet the standards that Democrats are looking for. It is not, focused on regulating commerce. This is just a tax, right? And the Democrats were pretending as though it wasn't a tax when Obama and other Democrats were pushing for the passing of the Affordable Care Act. But this is really a tax, and it's a tax on who, right? It's a tax on the middle class, right? And it's because they pay the bulk of the taxes, right? That's a bit up for debate. But upper class and middle class people are paying for this, right? They're essentially going to be the ones who would be taxed by this. Well, even though that's a good way to spin this, it turns out that most of those people have insurance, so they're actually not going to be paying the tax. The people who are going to be paying the tax are the few people who lack insurance, and even with the Affordable Care Act changes. And so we think that there are going to be about 23 million people who don't have insurance after the Affordable Care Act is fully implemented. So the Affordable Care Act, as you'll read this week, has lots of provisions to cover people who are uninsured, but we still think there are going to be about 23 million people left uninsured, and some of those people will be paying the tax. Some of those people will fall into the exceptions for the individual mandate. So we really actually don't know how many people will be paying the tax. I estimate that it's probably about 5 to 10 million people who might pay this tax, but those people will have the option of getting affordable insurance from various sources. So we'll see. I think some people will be persuaded just to buy insurance that is somewhat affordable. And then remember, the insurance that you need for this requirement is minimum. So that's why it's called the minimum essential coverage requirement, because it's really all about a really low level of insurance. So a really basic plan, $50 a month that only covers catastrophic problems that may arise. That kind of plan would qualify. There's really, there aren't that many plans that don't fall into this minimum standard. So just realize that people can get a really basic level, low level insurance. It might not cover much at all, but meet this requirement and actually avoid paying the tax. And so some people are probably going to just, take that route, and we'll see what happens. All right, so with regards to Medicaid expansion, the courts essentially said that the expansion of Medicaid that the government is looking for, and what the government wants, is for all states to increase their eligibility for Medicaid so that anyone who has an income level of 133% of the federal poverty level or below, those people are going to be eligible for Medicaid now. So Medicaid is insurance for poor people in this country, and so anyone making that amount of money, 133% of the federal poverty level or lower, will be offered Medicaid. Anyone. Now, the reason that's different is because most states don't offer Medicaid to anyone. They offer Medicaid to women with children and to families. So they're trying to cover a certain group of people. They do not offer coverage to childless adults. So grown men walking around who don't have jobs are not really the target for Medicaid. So you can think about why, right? We're a country where people really are focused on you taking care of yourself, being as independent as possible, getting out there, being productive in the economy. And so if we give you a crutch like this, free health insurance, just because you haven't gotten a job yet, then what's your incentive to get out there and participate in the economy, right? You don't have much of an incentive. So the idea is that the states don't cover those people because they're trying to push them to get involved in the economy. Now, with this expansion, the expansion says everyone, look, every poor person out there gets health insurance if they don't have an income above 133% of the federal poverty level. The Supreme Court says that's a fundamental shift in how Medicaid operates. That's something the states could not have predicted. That's something the states could not have anticipated when they signed up for Medicaid. When they signed up for Medicaid, it was a more restricted group of people who were going to benefit from this federal state creation, and it was not really geared towards just covering all poor people out there regardless of their circumstances. Okay, so that's really important. It's not something that most people who are health policy experts or advocates for the poor thought was going to happen. So the Supreme Court really surprised a lot of people with this stance, and quite a few people are upset that they even really touched this, because if you look at the lower courts had no problem at all with Medicaid expansion. They said, look, this is clearly within the federal government's power to tie certain conditions to federal funding, and so whatever they want to require states to do is fine, and all states have to do is just not take the money. Well, the Supreme Court says, well, that's not quite true, because the character of the degree of what you're trying to get people to do, what you're trying to get states to do, and the changes you're trying to get them to make matters. And so when you're making these fundamental shifts that are so great in the Medicaid program, they should actually be an exception to the rule here. And so this use of the spending power is actually unconstitutional. So what's the remedy? The remedy is that Congress will not be able to withdraw all Medicaid funds from states if they do not expand their programs. So this basically allows states to have the option to expand Medicaid to include everyone with an income below 133% of the federal poverty level or not. So many states are just going to keep their current program, but there are some states who are going to be really interested in expanding the program to include all the childless adults. So if you think about who those people are, a number of those people are homeless. With all of the vets coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan and other places, we're going to see a number of young men and women who don't have jobs because they may not have skills that transfer over into jobs that are available in society. So they're going to need some care, and obviously if they've been in combat, but they're let's say that their VA benefits aren't adequate, they're going to need some additional care and additional health insurance and so on. So we're going to have more people like that. We're going to have homeless vets, as we've always had, unfortunately, and there are going to be some young homeless vets out there. And how do they get health care? Well, they don't get health care typically, and so Medicaid expansion would help that group of people. And so just have to, you have to think about who falls into these groups and who may benefit and who may not benefit, and the various conditions that people are in when they are poor and in need of programs like this. All right. So, as I said, no change for most states, but some will change. And I think this is a good outcome for Justice Roberts, who's more of a conservative justice and who's the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court and who wrote the opinion. All right. What are the policy implications of all this stuff for the average citizen? Well, you know what? Most people aren't affected. Why are they not affected? Because most people already have health insurance. So this stuff really doesn't apply to the vast majority of the country. And so we're really only talking about 20 plus million Americans who are affected by this. So a fraction of our society, right? These are working poor people, as you read about last week in the access to care section. Working poor people who really have a hard time keeping health insurance, or it's just not affordable for them. They need a more affordable option. So those are the people who are uninsured. Those are the people who we're trying to push to get insured, and we're also at the same time trying to offer them affordable options through something called a health insurance exchange, where the federal government is providing subsidies for people to purchase insurance. So that's how we offer them an affordable option. Without that affordable option, they still wouldn't be able to buy insurance because insurance companies just had not been offering them anything that actually works. So the insurance companies say to the federal government, well, if you give us some subsidies, we can offer some affordable plans to these people. And so those are the people who are going to be affected. The average citizen won't be affected at all by any of this, even though everyone's so up in arms and watching it and so on, and they don't want to be forced to buy insurance. But if you already have insurance, you're not going to be forced to do anything because you already have it. It's like saying I'm going to force you to buy a house when you have 3 houses. It doesn't matter, right? So we think that an estimated 28 million people should get insurance as a result of all the provisions of the Affordable Care Act. But these estimates were based on Medicaid expanding. So if Medicaid doesn't expand, this number is going to be lower. So if states decided they don't want Medicaid expansion, then this number may be down in the 15 million or so on. So we might end up with a larger number of uninsured people than we anticipated, even after the Affordable Care Act, which will be, unfortunate and will be a huge challenge moving forward for our country. But we know even now, with the notion that Medicaid would expand in every state, that we would end up with about 23 million people who wouldn't have health insurance. So the requirement, of course, is buy health insurance for yourself, which most Americans have already done, or pay a penalty. The people who will pay this penalty will mainly be healthy, single young adults, some of whom may have dependents, but most of whom will not. They're just not buying insurance because they don't think they need it, because they're indestructible and so on. They're going to be over 26 because those 26 and under can stay on their parents' insurance. Or they're going to be people whose parents say, you know what, sorry, I know you're under 26, but you can't stay on my insurance. So you're going to have to go out there and fend for yourself. And I'm probably one of those parents who would do that. So, they're definitely going to be those kids out there who are under 26, but over 18, over 22, and so on, who aren't on their parents' insurance. All right. Now, some people are going to make this calculation, and I think a lot of healthy people with no kids are going to say, well, look, should I buy insurance or should I take the penalty? You know what? If the penalty is only $95 and health insurance costs me $600 for the year, I'm going to pay the $95 and move on with my life and keep my money in my pocket. And I think that's what's going to happen for a lot of people. But really, who knows? We'll just have to watch and see what people do. The future of this really remains to be seen. All right. Thanks a lot. I look forward to your discussion comments throughout the week. Take care.